While new polling data ahead of elections shows that young people in South Africa are increasingly concerned about their future, according to a survey done by charity organization Ichikowitz Family Foundation, young people feel limited by their choices on the ballot. 58% of those who would vote in favor of the African National Congress, the 12% for the DA, and 9% suggest that they would elect the EFF. So to unpack this further, I'm joined by the foundation's executive chairman, Ivor Ichikowitz. Ivor, thanks a lot for joining us on Morning News today. Young people have been the biggest topic when it comes to these elections, and unfortunately some rhetoric and sentiment shared by many young people is that they don't know who to vote for because they don't know who stands up for their rights, especially 25 years into our democracy.
Young South Africans, the demographic we're talking about, 18 to 24-year-olds, are our future. They are the people that are going to be the business leaders, the politicians, the decision makers, the thought leaders, and their opinion is probably the most important opinion in the country. And that's why we've gone out and done scientific polling data to see what these people really think. And we've done it right across the political and economic spectrum, and it's quite a big sample. And this disillusionment is the one theme that comes out all the time. Young South Africans don't have a political home today, and that is very concerning. If you think about it, our history came about because of the fact that young South Africans made a choice. They decided that their democracy was important to them, and they got out and they made their opinions known, and they did that because they had a political home. The ANC was their political home. Today, the polling data, the science is telling us that these people are more disillusioned than they've ever been before, and they don't know what decisions to make, and that's very, very concerning.
That is very interesting, because if they feel as though the African National Congress, which at the time, when you're speaking about the liberation movement, a significant portion of them were young people at the time. Our ministers were young at the time, you know, in terms of the liberation struggle. One would think that they would maybe even share different sentiment towards the EFF, since the EFF is seen as a younger party, you know, a breakaway from the African National Congress, but now its own entity, which constitutes a lot of young people. But that's not what the stats are saying?
The stats are showing something really interesting. You're quite right. My generation would say that the EFF would be the natural home for young South Africans because they want radical change. But what the science is showing is they don't want radical change. 81% of the people that we polled believed that land redistribution would be bad for the country. Now, that is really interesting.
And I have to ask about your sample size. When you're saying this 81%, is it across the economic playing field, across the country?
Absolutely. Hundreds of young South Africans, 18 to 24 years old, and that's kind of the sweet spot, very evenly distributed between the poorest of the poor, middle class, wealthy South Africans, right across the colour spectrum. This is a real sample of what South Africa represents today. 81% do not believe that something like land distribution would be good for the country. Now, that's not what kind of popularist belief is. We're also finding other really interesting things. Young South Africans are very pessimistic about Africa. 30% of young South Africans believe that Africa is going in the wrong direction, completely. So we've got Afro-pessimism added to the fact that there's no political home, added to disillusionment, added to a question mark about the democratic process itself. A lot of young South Africans don't believe in the democratic process. Only 50% voted in the last election. 75% say they're going to vote in this election, but the truth is that it probably won't be much more than 50%. That means that these people are going to find another way to make their voices heard. And that completely ties in with what's going on in the rest of the world.
How are they going to make their voices heard? And I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question. If you can say this right, you perhaps have solved all of our problems for the next 25 years. What do young people want, and how do we give it to them?
My concern is that young people right now don't know what they want. If you take the data, you'll probably find that what young people want is they want a voice. They want their voice to be heard. They want a political home. They want a society that they can feel part of, that they can feel inclusive and included in. And it isn't what our society is today, but this is not unique to South Africa. It's really interesting. This data ties in with what's going on in the rest of the democratic world. And there's now a question mark as to whether democracy is really the way to achieve change. The risk we have is if the political leadership doesn't heed this call, doesn't get to the bottom of what young people want, and I'll give you my opinion in a minute, you are going to find that young people are going to start voting with their feet. They're going to do what they're doing elsewhere in the world, which is take to the streets and create a populist agenda, which is going to be very challenging for whoever the next government is
now,
going to be.
Now, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we'd love to go into that, but it almost reminds me of what's happening currently in France with the Yellow Vest protests, protesting against the present and high fuel price and the high cost of living, where people are actually taking to the streets now because they feel as though they're not being heard. But we're going to leave our conversation there. Insightful revelations from the study in itself, and hopefully political parties are listening to you this morning.
I hope so too.
Ivor Ichikowitz giving us more information and insight, especially ahead of the elections, in terms of that million-dollar question really is, what do young people want? And are political parties actually able to give them what they want?